They say if a man suddenly moves out of the home he shares with the mother of his children and rents a small apartment just a few blocks away, it's a red flag. People talk. They assume the worst. Cheating? A breakup? Something scandalous. But what if the truth is far more disturbing than any rumor you could fabricate? Philip Seymour Hoffman was living alone in a small New York apartment in early 2014. He had just wrapped several high-profile projects. He had 3 kids, a long-term partner who loved him, and the world at his feet. And yet, days later, he was found dead in his bathroom, a needle still in his arm. This wasn't a fall from grace. It was the slow unraveling of a man too honest, too gifted, and perhaps too human for the world that adored him on screen and ignored him off it. Welcome to Unravel, where we dig beneath the headlines and behind the curtain. If you're tired of the shallow takes and want to know what really lies beneath stories like this one, consider subscribing now. We don't just tell stories to expose truths. Let's get into it. Philip Seymour Hoffman wasn't just another Oscar-winning actor. He was considered one of the most fearless performers of his generation. Not because he looked like a movie star didn't, but because he wasn't afraid to be ugly, to be vulnerable, to play broken men without a trace of vanity. His roles, whether as the manipulative Truman Capote, the creepy loner in Happiness, or the complicated cult leader in The Master, were more than performances. They were confessions. And maybe that's where the trouble began. Born in 1967 in a suburb of Rochester, New York, Philip's childhood wasn't particularly tragic. At least not on paper. His parents divorced when he was 9. His mother, a tough, educated woman, became a judge and raised 4 kids on her own. Philip found acting by accident after a sports injury ended his wrestling dreams. He stumbled into drama club. The stage offered him something sports never could, not just applause, but escape. He went on to study at NYU's Tisch School of the Arts, where classmates remember him as intense, driven, and already carrying a heaviness he never quite put down. By the time he graduated in 1989, Hoffman had already dipped into New York's infamous nightlife, where drugs and alcohol weren't just common, they were currency. At 22, just when most young actors are grinding through bit parts and waiting tables, Hoffman checked himself into rehab. It wasn't rock bottom. Not yet. It was foresight. He knew where he was headed, and he didn't want to go there. For the next 2 decades, he would stay clean, at least physically. But here's the problem. Sobriety doesn't erase addiction. It cages it, and every day becomes a negotiation with the beast that never left, just slept. As Hoffman's career began to blossom in the 90s, so did the myth around him. He wasn't Hollywood handsome, but he had something better: authenticity. He looked like us. He hurt like us. And he wasn't afraid to put that hurt on display. Directors like Paul Thomas Anderson saw it. So did Meryl Streep, who once said Hoffman made even the most despicable characters feel tragically human. That wasn't acting. That was alchemy. In 2005, Hoffman won the Academy Award for Best Actor for Capote. It was a transformative performance, one that required him to lose weight, shift his voice, alter his posture, and embody a man as brilliant as he was deeply flawed. But while the world celebrated, Hoffman himself admitted the role made him feel mentally unbalanced. He stayed in character for months, didn't break between takes, didn't sleep well, didn't come out clean. The line between actor and character, between reality and art, blurred dangerously. Still, he kept working. He met costume designer Mimi O'Donnell on a play in 1999, and by the early 2000s, they were partners in every sense. They had 3 children together. For over a decade, he stayed sober. Professionally, he was thriving. Critics adored him. Directors lined up to cast him, and fans appreciated that he never sold out, even when he joined a blockbuster franchise like The Hunger Games. But beneath the accolades and interviews, cracks were forming. In 2012, something shifted. Friends noticed he was withdrawing. He confessed to Mimi that he had started drinking again. At first, just a few drinks, then pills, then something far worse. Within months, Hoffman was in full relapse. The man who had battled addiction in his early 20s was now back in the ring, but this time older, more tired, and with far more to lose. He checked into rehab again. Only 10 days. A band-aid over a bullet wound. Afterward, he moved into his separate apartment, not because he and Mimi had fallen out of love, but because he didn't want his children to see what he had become. Rumors swirled. Paparazzi speculated. But no one really knew. Not even his closest friends. Because here's the uncomfortable truth. When a person is spiraling, they often do it silently. Especially men. Especially famous men. Especially the ones who've been taught that their pain is only valuable when it's packaged into a performance. As we left off, Philip Seymour Hoffman had isolated himself in a nearby apartment, just blocks from his family's home. But distance isn't always about geography. Sometimes, it's the space created by shame, the quiet decision to shield the people you love from the version of yourself that you no longer recognize. In 2013, Hoffman's relapse began to deepen. This wasn't the dramatic free fall often portrayed in tabloids. It was slow, fragmented, and eerily quiet. At first, it looked manageable, at least on the outside. A drink here, a prescription there, a conversation with Mimi where he admitted he was trying to get it under control. Trying. That word would become haunting. Friends reported that he was still showing up to work, still being Philip, still charming, brilliant, and professional, but behind the eyes, something had shifted. Even in interviews, he seemed distracted, fatigued, often rambling or repeating himself. At the Venice Film Festival, promoting The Master, he appeared disoriented, almost like a ghost in his own body. This wasn't a man partying. This was a man unraveling. And then came something darker. According to his close friend, writer Shalom Auslander, Hoffman checked into a detox facility for a second time in 2013. This stay was short, intense, and most disturbingly violated. While there, another patient allegedly filmed Hoffman during a group therapy session without his knowledge. Those videos were then offered to a media outlet, not out of concern for his well-being, but as leverage. The story, as Auslander tells it, is nauseating. Hoffman was reportedly coerced into giving an exclusive interview, under the implied threat that the footage of his most vulnerable moments would be leaked if he refused. It's worth pausing here not just to register the invasion of privacy, but to understand what that kind of exploitation does to a person already crumbling from within. Because here's the reality: addiction doesn't just destroy the body, it shreds the psyche. It convinces you that you are less than human. And in Hoffman's case, that message was reinforcedly by a media machine ready to turn his pain into profit. There is something almost surgical in the way fame isolates and consumes people who already doubt their own worth. But let's be clear, Hoffman wasn't some reckless, washed-up star clinging to relevance. He was still being cast in major films. He was still considered one of the finest actors alive. He was filming the Hunger Games franchise. He was preparing a new TV series. Happy-ish. He was adored, respected, needed, and none of that was enough. Which brings us to a critical point: how does someone so seemingly surrounded still feel so alone? According to Mimi O'Donnell, the answer lies not in who he was with, but in what he was fighting. Addiction, for Hoffman, was never a singular opponent. It was layered, tied to artistic pressure, existential fatigue, a punishing work ethic, and an almost obsessive internal standard of excellence. Mimi later admitted that he'd begun to hate acting, not because he lost his love for the craft, but because the emotional toll was simply too great. There's something profoundly ironic about a man whose performances were lauded for their emotional honesty, losing the ability to share his real emotions outside of a script. And yet, Mimi remained by his side, even when he moved out, even when things got bad. She told friends she worried every single night, that every time he went out, she feared he wouldn't come home. This wasn't melodrama. It was prescience. She told him plainly, if you keep using, it's going to kill you. He believed her. And yet, he couldn't stop. We often think of addiction as a failure of willpower, as if sobriety is a simple choice, one that can be maintained by love, or talent, or parenting. But the truth is far more complicated. Hoffman had all those things. And still, the shadow pulled him back. By late 2013, Hoffman was spiraling. He switched from prescription drugs to illicit substances, the kind that had almost killed him 2 decades earlier. He tried to pull himself out again, entering rehab for a 3rd time. This wasn't a man giving up. This was a man clinging to the edge, refusing to let go, even as the storm closed in. But recovery doesn't always follow the neat narrative arcs we want it to. There's no guaranteed redemption. And this time, rehab didn't stick. He left the facility, detoxed, clean for a moment. He even thanked friends and family for helping him get through. There were signs of hope, plans for work, meetings on the calendar, lines memorized. But Mimi knew the signs too well. She saw the change in his eyes, the quiet, the distance, the isolation. He was no longer living, was enduring. And this is where we start asking harder questions. Not just about Hoffman, but about the system around him. Why wasn't there more help? Why did no one intervene? Was it fear? Respect? Or is there something more dangerous at play, the belief that gifted people are supposed to suffer? In the arts, we romanticize torment. We mythologize the tortured genius. But what if that myth is just an excuse to let people fall apart in peace? As long as they entertain us on the way down? Picking up from the slow collapse we detailed earlier, we now arrive at the most disorienting part of Philip Seymour Hoffman's final act, the part where perception and reality parted ways completely. To the outside world, he was still working, still showing up to set, still transforming into other people with uncanny precision. But internally, he was bleeding out, quietly, privately, and in plain sight. There's a dangerous illusion when it comes to people like Hoffman, people who are high-functioning in their pain. Because they don't scream, because they don't implode publicly, we assume they're okay. We forget that some of the most devastating struggles are the ones you can't see. And in Philip's case, that illusion kept everyone, including himself, in denial for far too long. In early 2014, Hoffman was juggling multiple projects. He had just filmed the pilot episode for Happy-ish, a dark comedy series that eerily mirrored his own emotional state. He was also in the middle of shooting The Hunger Games: Mockingjay Part 2, a global franchise that brought him into the spotlight of a younger generation. On the surface, it looked like he was bouncing back. Friends even described him as his old self, again engaged, focused, almost light. But the truth was more complicated. Behind the camera, he was isolating more than ever. Mimi O'Donnell noticed it. She knew the signs, the way he withdrew, how he avoided conversations, how his tone shifted when asked how he was doing. He told her he was clean again, and for a few weeks, maybe he was. But Mimi didn't feel reassured. She felt afraid, and she had reason to be. You see, addiction doesn't usually roar back with chaos. It slips in quietly. A mistext, a late arrival, a lie so small it barely qualifies as a lie. Hoffman, by now, was a master of making everyone else feel comfortable while he unraveled on the inside. That, after all, was his gift as an actor. He could make pain look manageable. But by January 2014, things were no longer manageable. On February 2nd, Philip Seymour Hoffman was found dead in his Manhattan apartment. He was 46 years old. The cause? Acute mixed drug intoxication. Heroin, cocaine, amphetamines, benzodiazepines. A cocktail that didn't just suggest a relapse, it screamed desperation. And yet, many who knew him were stunned. How could someone so intelligent, so disciplined, so revered, go out like this? That question is part of the tragedy and the trap. Because when we ask, how could this happen to him? What we're really saying is this isn't supposed to happen to people like him. As if pain discriminates. As if intelligence is a shield against self-destruction. As if addiction cares about your talent. It doesn't. In the days following his death, the media response was predictable. Heartfelt tributes, montage videos, stories about his greatest roles. There were tears on talk shows, tweets from celebrities, and articles speculating on what went wrong. But the real answers weren't found in headlines or eulogies. They were found in the quiet details of a life lived under constant pressure internally and externally. For one, Hoffman's schedule had been relentless for years. Between method acting, parenting, rehearsals, award circuits, and emotional preparation for every role, he was rarely allowed to rest. He once said that acting isn't hard, but doing it well is painful. And for Hoffman, doing it well wasn't a choice, it was a compulsion. Many of his roles demanded full psychological immersion. For Capote, he reportedly stayed in character for months. For the master, he drew from his own battles with control and vulnerability. He didn't just play characters, she lived them. But what happens when there's no off switch? What happens when your career rewards you for diving into darkness and punishes you for stepping back? Hoffman wasn't just battling addiction. He was battling a profession that asked him to pour out his soul on command and a public that praised him for doing so, but only from a safe distance. There's a reason many actors refer to filming as emotional surgery. The problem is nobody tells you who's responsible for stitching you up afterward. And here's another uncomfortable truth. Hoffman tried to survive. He went to rehab. He told the people closest to him that he was struggling. He made attempts multiple times to break the cycle. But addiction isn't a battle you win once. It's a war of attrition. And sometimes, even the strongest fighters lose. Perhaps what makes Hoffman's story so devastating is that he didn't fit the stereotype of the fallen star. He wasn't reckless. He wasn't washed up. He wasn't bitter. He was working. He was beloved. He was, by all appearances, functioning. And that's precisely why his story should terrify us. Because it reminds us that pain doesn't always wear a mask. Sometimes, it smiles on camera. Sometimes, it nails the scene in one take. Sometimes, it tucks its children in at night and whispers, "I'm okay." The industry, meanwhile, keeps applauding. There was no intervention, no public breakdown, no explosive scandal. Just a man quietly disappearing under the weight of his own expectations, the demands of his art, and the deafening silence of a world that prefers its artists tortured as long as they keep performing. What makes the story of Philip Seymour Hoffman even more unsettling is the way his death forced a brief pause in the relentless rhythm of Hollywood, but only just for a few days. The tributes poured in. Actors, directors, fans, and industry insiders all shared memories of his kindness, humility, and incredible depth as a performer. Vigils were held. Columns were written. But beneath all the mourning was something else, something left unspoken. Because to truly understand what happened to Hoffman, we need to stop talking about him as just an individual tragedy. We need to start talking about the system that failed him. The culture that both raised him up and slowly tore him down. The industry that celebrates artistic suffering as noble and necessary and then acts shocked when the artist collapses under it. Hollywood has a long, romanticized history with brokenness. We glamorize the troubled genius. We tell ourselves that suffering sharpens talent, that the best art comes from pain. And when someone like Hoffman pours that pain into their work, we applaud loudly. But when that same pain spills into their personal life, we distance ourselves. We treat it like a separate issue, a personal failure, as if it had nothing to do with the environment we created. Let's call this what it is, a dangerous double standard. The truth is, the very things that made Hoffman so magnetic on screen, his raw vulnerability, his emotional availability, his willingness to go to dark places, were the same traits that left him exposed when the camera stopped rolling. He didn't compartmentalize like other actors. He didn't put up walls. He lived in the roles, and he carried them home. Take Capote, for example. Hoffman spent months internalizing the eccentricities, fears, and contradictions of Truman Capote. He admitted that staying in character took a toll on his mental health. He became withdrawn, unstable, anxious. But the performance was brilliant. He won the Oscar. The world cheered. No one asked how he was doing. Or consider The Master, a film that delves into manipulation, trauma, and spiritual emptiness. Hoffman's performance is mesmerizing, but behind the scenes, he was battling a relapse. He was using again. He was losing sleep. He was falling apart. And again, the world cheered. It's not that Hoffman didn't have support. Mimi O'Donnell was there, deeply aware of what was happening. She supported him, warned him, even braced herself for the worst. But there's only so much one person can do when the system itself keeps rewarding destructive patterns. Even his professional circles, while filled with people who admired and loved him, largely remained quiet. Some might say it wasn't their place. Others might admit they didn't see it. But let's ask the harder question: would they have spoken up if he wasn't still delivering brilliant performances? In a world where success is measured by output, the humanity of the person behind the work often gets lost. And let's not forget the media's role. As soon as Hoffman's struggles became public, outlets leapt at the story. There were timelines, charts, analysis of the substances found in his apartment. The headlines danced between tragedy and spectacle. Some covered his legacy. Others couldn't resist hinting at moral failure. Almost none addressed the systemic failure around him. One story that did emerge, though it faded quickly, was that of the alleged blackmail attempt involving footage taken during his rehab stay. If true, this means a man seeking help for a life-threatening illness was secretly recorded and pressured into giving an interview to protect his privacy. That's not journalism. That's cruelty. And it raises a disturbing point about how we treat celebrities who are visibly suffering. Do we really want them to get better? Or do we just want them to hold it together long enough to entertain us? Hoffman was not the first, nor will he be the last artist to be consumed by the very forces that shaped his genius. We've seen it before: River Phoenix, Heath Ledger, Amy Winehouse. And each time, we tell ourselves it was a tragic fluke, an anomaly, a personal weakness. But what if it's not a fluke? What if the entertainment industry is structurally hostile to mental health? What if we've built a system that extracts every ounce of creativity and emotional labor from its stars, while giving them little space to actually heal? Philip Seymour Hoffman's death didn't just expose the fragility of one man, it exposed the fragility of an entire culture that demands vulnerability as performance but stigmatizes it in reality. He was a father, a partner, a friend, and an artist who gave everything to his craft. And the world gave him applause, awards, and endless expectations. What it didn't give him, at least not enough of, was protection. And that's on all of us. After the dust of the media cycle settled, what remained was something far more enduring and quiet: grief. Not the public kind, not the performative kind, but the kind that lingers behind closed doors. In his absence, those closest to Philip Seymour Hoffman were left to piece together a life that had been defined not just by brilliance, but by battles few fully understood. For Mimi O'Donnell, the loss was both personal and existential. She had spent 15 years with him through the ascent, the relapse, the silences, the moments of defiant hope. In interviews years later, she described the weeks after his death as surreal, not just because he was gone, but because of how expected it had begun to feel in those final months. She once said, "I told him, if you use again, it will kill you." And then it did. But that inevitability didn't make it any easier. In fact, it made it worse. Knowing, watching, dreading, and then living it. And she wasn't alone. Their children, still young, still forming their earliest memories, were now growing up with an absence that would never fully be filled. Mimi described how their grief shaped her survival, how she kept going not for herself, but because she had to be present for them. Because in the face of overwhelming loss, routine was the only thread she could hold on to. There's something unspoken in how we talk about grief after someone famous dies. The spotlight tends to stay on the person who passed, while those left behind are expected to grieve privately. But the truth is, the trauma doesn't disappear when the headlines do. It mutates. It embeds itself in everyday life. For the O'Donnell-Hoffman family, that meant moving through the world while constantly fielding reminders: his face on a film poster, his voice in a trailer, strangers' whispers in public spaces. But amidst the personal mourning, a community also began its reckoning. Back in Fairport, New York, Hoffman's hometown locals were shaken. This wasn't just a distant celebrity. He had walked those streets, performed in school plays there, visited coffee shops. People remembered him not as a star, but as a person. The grief there was more intimate than one might expect. And in 2022, nearly 8 years after his passing, the town unveiled a statue of Hoffman. It was a quiet gesture, funded by a film producer who had grown close to Hoffman's mother, created by a Scottish sculptor. The statue doesn't glamorize his fame. It doesn't show him on stage or holding an Oscar. It simply tries to reflect who he was before the world knew his name. Marilyn, his mother, called it a loving memorial. But perhaps more importantly, the statue signified something the industry rarely offers: space to grieve a whole person, not just the fragments the public consumed. It's here we must pause and examine the ripple effect of loss. Because when someone like Hoffman dies, the tragedy doesn't just exist in his absence. It echoes in the people left behind. In the interviews Mimi would later give, there's a recurring theme: silence. The silence of a partner slipping away. The silence of people unsure how to help. The silence after the funeral, when everyone else returns to their lives, and you're left trying to rebuild yours with a piece missing. We don't talk enough about how addiction kills more than the addicted. It dismantles families. It creates ghosts in rooms where laughter used to be. And it leaves survivors with questions that never quite go away. Could I have done more? Was I too forgiving? Too hopeful? Too late? Even more complex is how Hoffman's death reinvigorated a broader conversation about mental health in the creative industries. For a time, there was renewed urgency: panels, op-eds, discussions about supporting artists beyond their output. But as with most tragedies in the public eye, that momentum eventually faded. The systemic issues: burnout, untreated depression, the stigma of therapy, the dehumanizing grind of fame remained largely intact. And yet, something did shift, however subtly. In the years since, more actors have come forward with their own stories. Stories of anxiety, panic attacks, substance use, and emotional exhaustion. Some have cited Hoffman's death as a wake-up call, a reminder that even the most revered among them are vulnerable, human, breakable. But this raises another unsettling question. Why does it take a loss to start these conversations? Why do we only humanize people when it's too late to help them? There's a quiet cruelty in the way we pedestal artists. We admire their sensitivity, their honesty, their ability to bleed on screen. But we don't always know what to do with that same honesty in real life. When the crying happens offstage, when the struggle isn't scripted, we get uncomfortable. We look away. We wait for the next performance. Mimi O'Donnell didn't look away. She stayed. She witnessed. She grieved. And eventually, she spoke, not to exploit Hoffman's legacy, but to remind us that loving someone in pain is a form of survival in itself. Her openness became an act of courage, an invitation for others to tell the truth about what it means to stand beside someone who's unraveling, and to keep standing even after they're gone. So now we arrive at the final and perhaps most uncomfortable layer of this entire story: the myth. The myth of the tortured genius. The narrative that somehow suffering and greatness go hand in hand. That the more an artist hurts, the more powerful their work becomes. It's a seductive idea, one we've romanticized for centuries. But in the wake of Philip Seymour Hoffman's death, we need to ask a hard question. Is this myth inspiring? Or is it killing people? Let's be honest, our culture doesn't just tolerate pain in artists. It expects it. We see it as the fuel for their fire. The late nights, the emotional breakdowns, the substance abuse, the psychological toll, it's all part of the package, right? We hear phrases like, he poured his soul into the role, or she suffered for her art. And we applaud. But who actually bears the cost of that applause? Hoffman embodied this myth in ways that were both brilliant and deeply troubling. He was fearless in his performances, willing to expose the parts of himself most people bury. But it wasn't an act. The darkness he portrayed wasn't borrowed, it came from somewhere real. And while audiences celebrated the emotional truth in his work, few asked what it took from him to deliver it. There's something deeply exploitative about this setup. We demand authenticity, vulnerability, rawness, yet we offer little support when those same qualities become liabilities off-screen. In fact, we often recoil from them. When artists are broken in ways we can't control or understand, we treat them as unstable, dramatic, or even inconvenient. But when they channel that same brokenness into a role, we give them trophies. It's a rigged system, and it doesn't start in adulthood. It starts early, in drama schools, where students are taught that bleeding for the role is noble. In early auditions, where actors who show pain effortlessly are praised for their range. In work environments where boundaries are blurred, where directors push and push because it's for the art. In press tours, where actors are asked to explain, relive, and repackage their trauma as marketable content. It never ends. For someone like Hoffman, who never seemed to have an off switch, this system was especially dangerous. He couldn't fake it. He wouldn't phone it in. Every performance came at a cost. And eventually, the bill came due. But let's not pretend this is just about actors. The tortured genius myth seeps into all corners of creative life. Writers, musicians, comedians. Pain is their brand. Struggle is their marketing. Burnout becomes proof of commitment. And when they die young or fall apart publicly, we turn them into legends. We turn their lives into cautionary tales and do nothing to prevent the next one. And here's the truly tragic part. The myth persists because it's convenient. It absolves institutions from responsibility. It shifts the narrative away from structural failure and onto individual weakness. He couldn't handle the pressure. She spiraled. They lost control. These statements may feel true, but they ignore the ecosystem of neglect, exploitation, and silence that often surrounds them. Even well-meaning fans can play a role in perpetuating this cycle. We claim to love authenticity, but often what we really love is performance. We love when actors cry on cue, when writers confess their demons in a neatly edited essay, when musicians turn heartbreak into chart-topping hits. But when those same people ask for space, or help, or forgiveness for not being on all the time, we hesitate. We want their art, not their mess. But what if the mess is part of being human? What if greatness doesn't have to come from suffering? What if, instead of expecting our artists to destroy themselves for our consumption, we built systems that allowed them to thrive creatively and personally? Imagine an industry where therapy was normalized, not whispered about, where taking a break wasn't a career death sentence, where directors and producers understood emotional safety the same way they understand lighting and sound, where fans didn't confuse access with entitlement. It's not impossible, but it does require us to rewrite the myth. Not erase pain. Pain is part of life, and it always will be, but remove the expectation that artists must suffer deeply to be worthy. Greatness doesn't have to come at the cost of mental health. Brilliance doesn't have to burn people out. Vulnerability doesn't have to be weaponized. Philip Seymour Hoffman gave us everything. Every gesture, every breath, every uncomfortable pause, and every character he ever played was a gift. And what did we give him in return? Praise. Yes. Awards. Yes. But did we create a world where he could survive? No. That failure belongs not just to the people around him, but to all of us. To a culture that prizes the product more than the person, that fetishizes pain without ever fully acknowledging its consequences. In remembering Hoffman, we need to do more than celebrate his work. We need to dismantle the narrative that suffering equals significance. We need to stop feeding the myth of the tortured genius and start valuing the whole human being behind the craft. Because if we don't, then we'll keep losing the ones who have the most to give too early, too quietly, and far too often. Philip Seymour Hoffman didn't die because he was weak. He didn't die because he lacked talent, love, or opportunity. He died because, somewhere along the way, we decided that brilliance was worth more than balance, that art mattered more than the artist, That a broken man giving everything to the world was just part of the price of greatness. But what if he had been allowed to keep something for himself? What if we stopped demanding that creators bleed so we can feel? What if survival, not self-destruction, was the story we celebrated? Maybe the most haunting part of Hoffman's death isn't how he died, but how familiar it feels. A pattern we've seen before, and one we may see again. Unless we start asking better questions. Unless we choose not to look away when the pain isn't pretty. When it doesn't make for a good headline or a powerful performance. And maybe, just maybe, that's where the real courage begins. Thank you for staying with us until the end. Subscribe to Unraveled so you never miss the truths that others leave buried.